why learning feels slow, and why that's normal. If you've ever felt like learning something new is taking forever, like everyone else seems to pick things up faster than you do, like maybe you're just not built for it, I want you to know something. Learning feels slow, not because you're bad at it, but because most people are taught the least effective methods. Think about that for a moment. It's not you. It's the approach. We live in a world that equates learning with consumption. We watch tutorials. We read books. We take notes. We highlight passages. And it all feels so productive, doesn't it? There's something satisfying about finishing a video, about turning the page, about seeing those neat yellow lines across a textbook. But here's the truth that no one really talks about. Consuming information feels productive, but it rarely changes the brain. Your brain doesn't transform just because information passed through your eyes or ears. It transforms when it has to do something with that information, when it has to wrestle with it, when it has to produce something. Yet most of us spend our time in this comfortable loop of taking things in over and over again. Rereading, rewatching, and highlighting create familiarity, not skill. And this is where so many people get stuck. They mistake recognition for understanding. They see something and think, oh yes, I know this, because it looks familiar. But familiarity is a trick. It's your brain saying, I've seen this before, not I can use this. There's a canyon of difference between those two states. So, what actually slows learning? What's the real culprit behind all that frustration? What actually slows learning is passive input without output. It's reading without recalling. It's watching without practicing. It's understanding in your head without ever testing whether that understanding can survive contact with reality. Your brain needs to generate, to produce, to make mistakes and correct them. Without that, you're just spinning your wheels, creating the illusion of progress. But here's where it gets interesting. Even when you do practice, even when you do try to produce output, there's something else that can sabotage the whole process. And it has to do with how you feel while you're doing it. Stress that's too high shuts learning down. Stress that's too low leads to boredom. Your brain has this sweet spot, this optimal zone, where learning happens most effectively. When you're too stressed, when the challenge feels overwhelming, when anxiety takes over, your prefrontal or cortex goes offline. You're in survival mode. The learning circuits shut down. But on the other end, when things are too easy, when there's no challenge at all, your brain essentially checks out. It doesn't bother encoding the experience because nothing important is happening. The brain learns fastest in the hard but doable zone, not comfort, not panic. This is the zone where you're slightly uncomfortable, where you're making errors but not drowning in them, where you have to think, but you're not paralyzed by confusion. It's that place where you finish a practice session feeling tired but accomplished, not defeated or bored. Most people avoid this zone. They retreat to comfort, or they push so hard they burn out. But this zone, this edge of your ability, is where the magic happens. And here's something crucial about operating in that zone. You're going to make mistakes, lots of them, and that's not just okay. It's necessary. But there's a catch. Mistakes don't ruin learning. Unnoticed mistakes do. When you practice something incorrectly, over and over, never realizing it's wrong, you're not building skill. You're building a very strong habit of doing it wrong. The key isn't to avoid mistakes. It's to notice them quickly, to get feedback, to correct course. That's what fast learners do differently. They create systems where their mistakes become visible. Once you understand that learning isn't about effort, it's about how the brain adapts, everything changes. You stop measuring your worth by how many hours you put in. You stop feeling guilty about not working hard enough. Instead, you start asking different questions, better questions. Questions like, am I getting the right kind of feedback? Am I practicing in the zone where my brain actually changes? Am I creating output or just consuming input? And one of the most powerful things you can do to help your brain adapt is to give it clarity about what matters. Because here's the thing, the brain filters aggressively. Clear goals tell it what matters. Every moment, your brain is bombarded with thousands of pieces of information. It has to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. Without clear goals, it's guessing. It's trying to figure out what's important based on vague signals. But when you give it a clear target, when you say, this is specifically what I'm trying to get better at, suddenly, everything becomes easier. Your brain knows what to encode. It knows what to notice. It knows what to remember. This is why narrow goals outperform vague ambitions every time. Get better at guitar is almost useless to your brain. It's too broad. There's no signal in all that noise. But play the specific chord progression smoothly at 80 beats per minute gives your brain something to work with. It knows what success looks like. It can direct your attention. It can measure progress. Narrow goals aren't limiting. They're liberating. They tell your brain exactly where to focus its incredible power to adapt. And here's the beautiful part. The part that should give you hope if you've been putting off learning something because you think it'll take forever. A huge portion of skill progress happens in the first 20 hours. Not 10,000 hours, not even 1,000, 20. When you're moving from, I have no idea what I'm doing, to, I can do this at a basic level, the progress curve is steep, incredibly steep. Those first 20 hours of focused, deliberate practice can take you from complete beginner to surprisingly functional, not to mastery, but a competence, to the point where you can actually enjoy the thing you're learning. This is the research Josh Kaufman popularized, and it flies in the face of everything we're usually told about learning. We hear about the 10,000 hour rule, and we think, I don't have that kind of time. So we don't start. But the truth is, you don't need that kind of time to become decent. You need consistency. You need focus. You need those 20 hours to be the right kind of practice. So, if you've been feeling like learning is slow, like it's harder for you than it should be, take a breath. It's not you. It's probably just that no one taught you how learning actually works, how your brain actually changes. And now that you're starting to understand it, now that you know about the zone of hard but doable, about the power of output over input, about how narrow goals light up your brain's ability to focus, everything can be different. And learning doesn't have to feel like pushing a boulder uphill. It can feel like momentum, like pieces clicking into place, like watching yourself become capable of something you weren't capable of before. And that feeling, that specific feeling of growth, is one of the most deeply satisfying experiences a human being can have. So rest now, let these ideas settle, and when you're ready to learn something new, you'll know how to begin. Not with more consumption, not with vague intentions, but with clear goals, with practice that produces output, with a willingness to exist in that uncomfortable but magical zone where your brain actually transforms. That's where fast learners live. And now you know the way there too. The brain's fast learning rules. Now that you understand why learning feels slow, let's talk about what actually makes it fast. Because there are rules. Not the kind of rules teachers give you, but the kind that are built into how your brain physically works. And when you align with these rules, learning stops being a struggle and starts being almost inevitable. The first rule is about size, about breaking things down. Learning accelerates when skills are broken into tiny, trainable parts. Think about what happens when someone tries to learn something big all at once. Learn Spanish, get good at basketball, master photography. These feel like single skills, but they're not. They're dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller skills bundled together. And your brain doesn't learn bundles very well. It learns specifics. When you break a skill down into its smallest trainable components, something remarkable happens. Each piece becomes achievable. You're not trying to learn Spanish. You're learning to pronounce this particular sound. You're not trying to master basketball. You're learning to position your elbow at this angle when you shoot. Suddenly, success becomes measurable. Your brain knows what it's working on. And more importantly, it can actually improve at that specific thing, which creates momentum, which creates confidence, which makes you want to keep going. But here's what's interesting about practice. More is not always better. In fact, more is often worse. Short, intense sessions beat long marathons. Your brain has a window of high-quality focus. For most people, for most skills, that window is somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes. During that window, your brain is plastic. It's malleable. It's encoding what you're doing into neural pathways. But after that window closes, you start getting diminishing returns. You're going through the motions. You're tired. You might even be practicing mistakes because you're too fatigued to notice them. Fast learners understand this. They don't pride themselves on 4-hour practice sessions. They pride themselves on 40 minutes of intense, focused work where every repetition matters, where they're fully present, where their brain is actually changing. And then they stop. They let their brain rest. They come back tomorrow. Because learning doesn't just happen during practice. A lot of it happens between sessions. This brings us to one of the most well-researched findings in all of learning science. Spaced practice beats cramming, even when total time is equal. Let's say you have 5 hours to learn something. You could do it all in one marathon session, or you could spread it across 5 days, 1 hour each day. Same total time, completely different results. When you space practice out, you give your brain time to consolidate, to move information from short-term storage into long-term memory, to forget just a little bit, so that when you come back to it, you have to work to remember. And that work, that retrieval effort, is what makes the memory stick. Cramming feels effective in the moment. You recognize everything. It's all familiar. But a week later, a month later, it's gone. Spaced practice feels harder because you do have to work to remember, but that difficulty is exactly what makes it permanent. And during those spaces between practice sessions, your brain is doing something crucial. Alternating focus and rest improves insight and retention. When you focus intensely on a problem, your brain enters what's called a narrow attentional state. You're zoomed in. You're working on the details. But insight, creativity, connection making, those often happen when you zoom back out, when you rest, when you let your mind wander. This is why people have breakthroughs in the shower, or on walks, or right before falling asleep. Your diffuse mode of thinking, that relaxed, wandering state, is making connections that your focused mode can't see. It's connecting what you just learned to things you already know. It's finding patterns. It's solving problems in the background. Fast learners don't just work hard, they also rest hard. They protect that diffuse time because they know it's not wasted. It's essential. And nowhere is this more true than with sleep. Sleep is not rest. It's where learning is physically rewritten into the brain. During sleep, particularly during deep sleep and REM sleep, your brain is replaying what you practiced. It's strengthening the synapses that were activated during the day. It's moving skills from conscious, effortful processes into automatic, unconscious ones. When you skip sleep, you're not just tired. You're literally preventing your brain from finishing the learning process. There's research showing that people who sleep after learning something retain it significantly better than people who stay awake, even if they're not thinking about what they learned. The brain is doing work while you're unconscious. It's editing, it's organizing, it's deciding what to keep and what to discard. This is why athletes, musicians, and top performers in any field prioritize sleep, not because they're lazy, because they know that's when the magic happens. And you don't even need a full night to get some of these benefits. Even short naps can measurably improve performance. A 20-minute nap after a practice session can boost retention. A 90-minute nap that includes a full sleep cycle can enhance motor learning and problem solving. Your brain is efficient. Give it even a small window, and it will use that time to consolidate, to strengthen, to improve. But let's come back to the practice itself, because not all practice is created equal. You can spend hours doing something and not improve at all if you're doing it wrong. Fast learners practice deliberately, not mindlessly. What does that mean? It means they're paying attention. Every repetition has a purpose. They're not just going through the motions. They're noticing what happens. They're asking, was that better? What went wrong? What should I adjust? Deliberate practice is tiring. It's mentally demanding. You can't do it while watching TV or chatting with someone. It requires your full attention because you're not just repeating. You're analyzing. You're comparing what you did to what you intended to do. You're catching errors before they become habits. This is why 10 minutes of deliberate practice can create more progress than an hour of mindless repetition. And within that deliberate practice, there's a specific zone where learning happens fastest. They work just outside their comfort zone, not way outside, not in the panic zone where everything falls apart, but just past the edge of what's comfortable. This is the zone where you're succeeding maybe 70 to 80% of the time. You're making errors, but not constantly. You're challenged, but not overwhelmed. This zone is uncomfortable. That's the point. Your brain doesn't change when things are easy. It changes when it has to stretch. Fast learners have made peace with this discomfort. They've learned to recognize it not as a sign that something's wrong, but as a sign that something's working, that their brain is in the process of rewiring itself. And here's a subtle thing that fast learners do that most people miss. They vary practice slightly to force adaptation. If you practice something exactly the same way every time, you get really good at that exact thing. But you don't develop deep, flexible skill. You develop a rigid pattern. Fast learners introduce variation. They change the context slightly. They adjust the conditions. They practice the same skill in different ways. A musician might play the same passage at different tempos, or with different dynamics, or starting from different points in the piece. A basketball player might shoot from slightly different angles, or after different movements, or under time pressure. This variation feels less efficient in the short term, but it creates robust learning. It forces your brain to understand the underlying principle, not just memorize a sequence. And that understanding transfers. It adapts. It lasts. And finally, one of the most powerful things fast learners do differently. They test themselves instead of reviewing passively. Most people study by reading their notes, by watching videos again, by going over material they've already covered. It feels productive. It feels safe, but it's weak. Testing yourself, actively trying to recall information or perform a skill without looking at the answer is hard. It's uncomfortable. You might fail, but that struggle to retrieve is exactly what strengthens memory. Every time you successfully pull something from memory, you make it easier to pull next time. And even when you fail to retrieve something, that failure signals to your brain, this is important. We need to strengthen this. Fast learners quiz themselves constantly. They use flashcards. They try to explain concepts without notes. They practice skills without looking at the instructions. They embrace the discomfort of not knowing because they understand that discomfort is the price of real learning, and they know that price is worth paying. So these are the rules. Break skills into tiny parts. Practice in short, intense sessions, in space that practice out over time. Alternate focus with rest. Protect your sleep. Practice deliberately, not mindlessly. Work just outside your comfort zone. Vary your practice to build flexibility, and test yourself instead of reviewing passively. These aren't tips or hacks. They're how the brain actually works. They're based on decades of research into memory, attention, skill acquisition, and neuroplasticity. And the beautiful thing is, you don't have to do all of them perfectly. Even implementing a few of these principles will accelerate your learning dramatically, because the brain wants to learn. It's built for it. It's designed to adapt and grow and improve. You just have to work with it instead of against it. You just have to follow the rules that are already written into your neurology. So as you rest now, as you drift towards sleep, know that even this rest is part of learning. Your brain is working. It's consolidating. It's preparing for tomorrow. And when tomorrow comes, you'll know how to practice in a way that actually creates change, in a way that honors how your brain really learns. That's what fast learners know. And now, so do you. How fast learners lock in what they learn. There's a difference between feeling like you know something and actually knowing it, between recognizing information when you see it and being able to pull it from your mind when you need it. And that difference is everything. Because in the real world, you don't get multiple choice. You don't get hints. You have to produce the answer, perform the skill, solve the problem, all on your own. This is where most people's learning strategies fall apart. And this is where fast learners pull ahead, because they understand something fundamental. Active recall strengthens memory far more than recognition. When you read something and think, yes, I understand that, you're using recognition. Your brain sees the information and says, this looks familiar. But recognition is weak. It's shallow. It doesn't prepare you for the moment when you actually need to use that knowledge. Active recall is different. It's closing the book and trying to remember what you just read. It's trying to solve the problem before looking at the solution. It's attempting to perform the skill without guidance. And it's hard. It feels inefficient. You stumble. You forget things. You get it wrong. But every time you force your brain to retrieve something from memory, you're strengthening that neural pathway. You're making it easier to access next time. You're transforming weak recognition into strong, reliable knowledge. Think about it like this. Recognition is seeing someone's face and thinking, I know this person. Active recall is remembering their name without any hints. One is passive. The other requires your brain to do real work. And that work is what creates lasting change. But here's the thing about practicing and recalling on your own. You can get things wrong. You can practice errors. You can recall incorrectly and reinforce the wrong information. This is why fast feedback prevents bad habits from forming. When you practice something wrong over and over, you're not just wasting time. You're actually building skill at doing it wrong. And the longer that goes on, the harder it becomes to correct. Fast learners set up systems that give them feedback quickly. They record themselves. They use teachers or coaches. They check their answers immediately after attempting a problem. They don't wait until the end of a long practice session to find out they've been doing it wrong the whole time. Because early feedback is cheap. It's easy to correct. But late feedback, discovering after weeks or months that you've been practicing incorrectly, that's expensive. That requires unlearning and relearning, which takes far more effort than learning it right the first time. And here's something surprising about errors and feedback. Errors followed by correction drive stronger brain changes than perfect practice. You might think the goal is to never make mistakes, to practice perfectly every time. But that's not how the brain learns best. When you make an error and then immediately correct it, your brain gets a strong learning signal. It notices the difference between what you did and what you should have done. That contrast, that prediction error, is what drives plasticity. It's what makes your brain adapt. So, mistakes aren't the enemy. Uncorrected mistakes are the enemy. Mistakes that you don't notice are the enemy. But mistakes that you catch, that you learn from, that you correct, those are actually accelerating your learning. This is why fast learners aren't afraid to work at the edge of their ability, where errors are frequent. They know those errors are fuel for growth, as long as they're paying attention and adjusting. Now let's talk about one of the simplest but most powerful learning techniques most people never use: writing beats, rereading, because it forces deeper processing. When you reread something, your eyes move across the page. The words look familiar, and your brain tells you, yes, I know this. But you haven't actually processed it deeply. You haven't transformed it. You haven't made it yours. When you write, when you try to explain something in your own words, when you summarize, when you make connections to other ideas, you can't fake it. You immediately discover what you actually understand and what you only thought you understood. Writing is thinking. It's not just recording thoughts you already have. It's generating thoughts, clarifying them, organizing them, and that process, that active engagement with the material, is what creates real understanding. This is closely related to another powerful technique. Rephrasing ideas in your own words exposes gaps instantly. When you try to explain something using only your own language, not the textbook's language or the teacher's language, you find out very quickly whether you actually get it. If you can rephrase something clearly and accurately, you understand it. If you stumble, if you have to look back at the source, if you realize you don't know how to say it differently, that's valuable information. That's showing you exactly where your understanding breaks down. Fast learners do this constantly. They read something and immediately try to say it back differently. They watch a tutorial and then explain it aloud as if teaching someone else. They don't move on until they can rephrase it, because they know that rephrasing is the test that matters. It's harder than recognition. It's even harder than active recall, but it's also more honest. It shows you the truth about what you know. And if you really want to lock something into memory, if you want to understand it at the deepest level, there's one technique that beats almost everything else: teaching. Even imaginary teaching doubles retention. There's research showing that when people study with the intention of teaching the material to someone else, they learn it better than people who study with the intention of being tested on it. Teaching forces you to organize information clearly, to anticipate questions, to connect ideas, to simplify without losing accuracy. And here's the beautiful thing: you don't even need a real student. You can teach to an imaginary person. You can explain concepts to yourself in the shower. You can walk around your room giving a lecture to an empty chair. Your brain doesn't know the difference. The act of organizing information for teaching, of trying to make it clear to someone else, creates the same learning benefits, whether or not anyone is actually listening. Now, beyond these techniques for strengthening memory, there are accelerators, things you can do that multiply the effectiveness of your learning. And one of the most powerful is this: using multiple senses creates richer memory networks. When you learn something using only one sense, say, just reading text, you create one set of neural connections. But when you engage multiple senses, you create multiple pathways to that same information. You're building a web of connections instead of a single thread. This is why pairing visuals with words strengthens recall. When you see a diagram while reading an explanation, when you watch a demonstration while hearing the instructions, when you draw a picture of a concept you're trying to understand, you're not just adding redundancy. You're creating different entry points to that memory. Later, when you try to recall it, you have multiple ways in. If you can't remember the words, maybe you can remember the image, and that image can trigger the words. This is also why hands-on practice is so much more effective than just watching or reading. When you physically do something, you're engaging your motor system, your visual system, your spatial awareness, maybe even your sense of touch. All of those become associated with the skill or knowledge. All of those become part of the memory. And the more richly encoded a memory is, the more ways you have to access it, the more durable it becomes. But here's where learning gets really interesting, where it starts to look less like neat, organized study and more like intentional chaos, because it turns out that mixing things up is actually better than keeping them separate. Interleaving related skills improves real-world performance. And most people practice in blocks. They work on one thing until they feel comfortable, then move to the next thing. 30 minutes on this skill, 30 minutes on that skill. Everything neat and organized. Fast learners interleave. They mix related skills together in the same session. They practice skill A, then skill B, then skill C, then back to skill A. It feels messier. It feels less efficient, but it's dramatically more effective. Here's why. When you practice in blocks, you're not really learning to distinguish between different situations or decide which approach to use. You're just repeating the same thing over and over in the same context. But real life isn't blocked. Real life requires you to recognize what kind of problem you're facing and select the right skill. When you interleave, you're constantly having to identify what's needed and retrieve the appropriate response. That discrimination, that selection process is learning. A tennis player who practices only forehands for an hour isn't learning when to use a forehand versus a backhand. But a player who alternates randomly between shots is learning to read the situation and respond appropriately. That's the skill that matters in an actual game. And this principle extends even further. Practicing in varied contexts builds flexibility, not fragility. If you always practice in the same room, at the same time, with the same setup, you might get very good at performing in that exact situation. But put you in a different context, a different time of day, a different environment, a little bit of pressure or distraction, and your performance might fall apart. Because you didn't learn the skill itself. You learned the skill in that specific context. Fast learners deliberately vary the context of their practice. They study in different locations. They practice at different times of day. They introduce small variations in conditions. This feels less controlled, less scientific, but it creates robust learning. It forces your brain to extract the essential elements of the skill, the parts that work regardless of context, and that's what transfers. that's what lasts. Think about a child learning language. They don't learn the word dog by seeing the same dog in the same place every time. They learn it by seeing different dogs in different places, in different situations. That variation is what allows them to extract the concept of dog rather than just memorizing one specific instance. The same principle applies to any skill, any knowledge. Variation isn't sloppiness, it's sophistication. So here's what fast learners do differently when they practice. They test themselves with active recall instead of just reviewing. They set up systems for fast feedback, so errors get caught early. They embrace mistakes as learning opportunities. They write and rephrase instead of passively rereading. They explain concepts as if teaching someone else. They engage multiple senses whenever possible. They interleave related skills instead of blocking them. And they practice in varied contexts to build real-world resilience. These aren't tricks. These aren't shortcuts. They're alignments. They're ways of working with your brain's natural learning mechanisms instead of against them. And the difference in results is staggering. Two people can spend the same amount of time practicing, but if one is using passive review and blocked practice in a single context, and the other is using active recall and interleaved practice with variation, they're not going to make the same progress, not even close. The second person will learn faster, retain longer, and perform better under varied conditions, not because they're smarter or more talented, because they understand how learning actually works, and they're willing to do things that feel harder in the moment because they know those things create easier performance later. This is the secret that separates fast learners from everyone else. They've made peace with difficulty. They've learned to trust the process, even when it feels inefficient. They know that the struggle to recall, the effort to rephrase, the confusion of interleaving, the challenge of varied practice, all of that difficulty is the mechanism of learning. It's not something to avoid. It's something to embrace. So as you rest now, as these ideas settle into your mind, know that your brain is already working with them, already connecting them to what you know, already preparing to use them. And when you next sit down to learn something, you'll have a completely different toolkit, a set of strategies that actually match how your brain works. And that matching, that alignment between method and mechanism, that's where fast learning lives. The mental game and what really keeps you going. We've talked about how the brain learns, about feedback and practice, and spacing and variation. But here's something that might surprise you. You don't always need to physically practice to get better. Mental rehearsal activates the same circuits as physical practice. Your brain doesn't fully distinguish between vividly imagining doing something and actually doing it. The same motor regions light up. The same neural pathways get activated. There's famous research where people who mentally practiced piano exercises improved almost as much as people who physically practiced them. Not quite as much, but close. Close enough that it matters. Athletes have known this for decades. They visualize their performance before competing. They mentally rehearse the perfect execution. And that mental rehearsal isn't just psychological, it's neurological. It's literally strengthening the same circuits that physical practice would strengthen. This is why you can practice anywhere. You can rehearse a speech while walking. You can mentally work through a problem while lying in bed. You can visualize the perfect golf swing while sitting in traffic. Your brain is building skill, even without your body moving. And when you combine mental rehearsal with physical practice, the effects multiply. You're getting repetitions in your mind and repetitions in your body, and both are contributing to the same neural networks. But here's something important about how you practice, whether mentally or physically. Starting with real-world tasks improves transfer. A lot of learning is broken down into components, into drills, into simplified exercises. And there's value in that. But if you only practice simplified versions, you might never develop the skill to handle the messy reality of actual performance. Fast learners start with the real thing early. Not exclusively, but early. They try to write the actual essay, not just practice grammar exercises. They try to have the actual conversation in a foreign language, not just memorize vocabulary. They attempt the actual project, even if they're not ready. Because real-world tasks have complexity that simplified drills don't capture. They have pressure, ambiguity, multiple demands happening at once. And your brain needs to learn to handle that complexity, not just perfect individual components in isolation. This doesn't mean you abandon focused practice. It means you move back and forth. You attempt the real task. You notice what's hard. You drill that specific component. Then you return to the real task. That cycle, real world to component, and back to real world, creates skill that actually transfers, that actually works when you need it. Now, all of this practice, all of this effort, requires something that's often overlooked. It requires that you keep going, that you maintain momentum over days and weeks and months. And this is where most people fail. Not because they don't know how to practice, but because they stop practicing. They lose motivation. They lose track of whether they're improving. They lose the thread. Fast learners have figured something out about this. Tracking one tiny metric sustains motivation. Not 10 metrics. Not a complex spreadsheet. One thing. One number that goes up. Maybe it's how many words you can type per minute. Maybe it's how many consecutive days you practiced. Maybe it's how long you can hold a plank. The specific metric doesn't matter as much as the fact that you're tracking it and it's going up. There's something deeply satisfying to the human brain about watching a number increase. It creates a sense of progress, and visible progress compounds faster than motivation alone. Motivation is this mysterious, unreliable thing. Some days you have it, some days you don't. You can't control it. You can't summon it. But progress is real. Progress is evidence. And when you can see that you're better today than you were last week, that evidence creates its own motivation. It pulls you forward. This is why people who track their learning tend to stick with it longer and improve faster than people who don't. Not because tracking itself makes you better, but because it makes improvement visible. It turns this vague sense of, I think I'm getting better, maybe, into concrete data. And that data sustains you through the days when you don't feel like practicing. Because you can look at your numbers and know, regardless of how you feel, that this is working. But even with tracking, even with visible progress, there's still the problem of getting started each day, of sitting down to practice when you'd rather do anything else. And here's a technique that makes that easier. Time boxing reduces perfectionism and increases intensity. When you tell yourself, I'm going to practice for exactly 20 minutes, something shifts. The session becomes finite, manageable. You're not committing to some indefinite slog. You're committing to 20 minutes. And because it's only 20 minutes, you can go hard. You can be intense. You can focus completely because you know there's an end. Perfectionism thrives in open-ended sessions where you tell yourself you'll work until it's good enough. That good enough is a moving target. It's never quite there. But with a time box, the goal isn't perfection. The goal is to work with full focus for the defined time. And then you stop, even if you're not done. Even if it's not perfect, you stop. This does two things. First, it removes the pressure that prevents you from starting. Second, it trains you to work with intensity during the time you have. You're not pacing yourself for a marathon. You're sprinting for 20 minutes. And that intensity, that focused effort, is often more valuable than twice as much time spent at half speed, distracted and perfectionistic. And if you want to make starting even easier, if you want to reduce the friction of beginning each practice session, warm-ups reduce resistance and speed entry into flow. Athletes don't go straight into peak performance. They warm up, they ease into it. The same principle applies to cognitive work, to creative work, to any kind of practice. A warm-up might be 5 minutes of something easy related to your practice, playing simple scales before attempting a difficult piece, reading over your notes before trying to recall them, doing simple problems before tackling complex ones. The warm-up isn't wasted time. It's an on-ramp. It's letting your brain shift gears from whatever you were doing before into the focused state you need for practice. And that transition is easier, faster, and more reliable when you have a consistent warm-up routine. Now, we need to talk about something deeper, something that underlies all of this, because techniques and strategies are important, but they're not the whole story. There's something else happening when people learn quickly and stick with it. Something emotional, something psychological, something about how they see themselves and the world. This is where it gets sticky. This is where learning stops being just a mechanical process and starts being deeply human. Emotion tags memories as important. Your brain is constantly deciding what to remember and what to forget. And one of the strongest signals it uses is emotion. When something has emotional weight, when it matters to you, when it surprises you, when it moves you, when it connects to something you care about, your brain marks it as significant. It gets prioritized for long-term storage. This is why you can forget 100 facts from a textbook, but remember a single story someone told you years ago. The story had emotion. It had human meaning. And your brain said, this is important. Keep this. Fast learners understand this. They don't try to learn everything in some neutral, detached way. They look for the emotion in what they're learning. They ask themselves why it matters. They connect it to something they care about. They find the story, the meaning, the human element, and that emotional connection makes the learning stick. And there's one emotion in particular that supercharges learning. Curiosity activates reward and memory systems simultaneously. When you're curious about something, when you genuinely want to know the answer, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical involved in reward and motivation. And that dopamine doesn't just feel good, it enhances memory formation. It opens up plasticity. It makes your brain more receptive to new information. This is why learning something you're curious about feels effortless compared to forcing yourself to memorize something you don't care about. Your brain is literally in a different state. The curiosity is doing neurological work. It's priming your memory systems. It's making you alert and focused without effort. Fast learners cultivate curiosity. They don't just accept information passively. They generate questions. They wonder. They look for puzzles and mysteries in what they're learning. And here's a simple technique that leverages this. Turning facts into questions improves recall. Instead of trying to remember the capital of France is Paris, you turn it into a question. What's the capital of France? This seems like a tiny change, but it's not. Questions create curiosity, even artificial curiosity. They create a gap between what you know and what you want to know, and your brain is wired to close gaps. When you study using questions instead of statements, you're activating that curiosity system, that seeking system, and everything becomes easier to remember. But perhaps the deepest factor in learning, the one that determines whether you persist through difficulty and setbacks, isn't about technique at all. It's about identity. Identity-based framing, I am a learner, increases consistency. When you think of learning as something you do, as an activity, you'll do it when you're motivated, when you have time, when conditions are right. But when you think of yourself as a learner, as someone for whom learning is part of who you are, everything changes. Identity is powerful because it's not about a specific goal or outcome. It's about the kind of person you are. And we tend to act in ways that are consistent with our identity. If you see yourself as a learner, then of course you practice. Of course you seek out challenges. Of course you ask questions and make mistakes and keep going. That's what learners do. It's not about willpower or motivation. It's about being consistent with who you are. This is why fast learners don't talk about learning as something external to them. They don't say, I'm trying to learn guitar. They say, I'm a guitarist. Even when they're terrible, even when they just started, the identity comes first. And the actions flow from that identity. You practice not because you have to, but because that's what someone like you does. Think about how different that feels, how much lighter, how much more sustainable. You're not forcing yourself to do something unnatural. You're simply acting in accordance with who you are. And over time, the evidence accumulates. You see yourself practicing. You see yourself improving. And that evidence reinforces the identity. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. So here's what this all means practically. You can use mental rehearsal to get extra repetitions without physical practice. You can start with real-world tasks early to ensure your skills transfer. You can track one simple metric to make progress visible. You can use time boxes to reduce perfectionism and increase intensity. You can create warm-up routines to ease into practice. You can look for emotional connections to make memories stick. You can cultivate curiosity by turning facts into questions. And you can adopt an identity as a learner, making consistency feel natural rather than forced. These aren't just tips, they're levers. They're ways of working with your psychology, not just your neurology, because you're not a computer. You're not a machine that just needs the right algorithm. You're a human being with emotions and identity and meaning making. And the fastest learning happens when you honor that, when you align technique with psychology, when you make learning not just effective, but also sustainable. Not just something you can do, but something you want to do. Something that feels like an expression of who you are. And as you rest now, as your mind drifts, know that these ideas are settling in, becoming part of how you think about learning, about yourself, about what's possible. You're not just learning how to learn faster. You're becoming someone who learns. And that identity, that shift in how you see yourself, that's the change that lasts. That's the change that compounds over years and decades. That's the change that transforms not just what you can do, but who you are, why you keep going when it gets hard. There's a moment that comes in every learning journey, the moment when the novelty wears off, when it stops being exciting and starts being work, when you realize this is going to take longer than you thought. This is where most people, quote, quit, not because they can't learn, but because they lose sight of why they started. Fast learners make it past this moment, and they do it because they have something most people don't take time to develop. A strong personal why increases persistence over months. Not a vague reason, not, it would be nice to know this, or someone told me I should. A real why, a reason that connects to something deep, to who you want to become, to what matters in your life, to a problem you need to solve, or a vision you want to realize. When the why is strong enough, the how becomes easier. You don't need to constantly motivate yourself because you're pulled forward by something meaningful. On days when you don't feel like practicing, the why reminds you what this is all for. It's not about discipline or willpower. It's about connection, about knowing that this effort right now is moving you towards something that actually matters. So if you're learning something or planning to learn something, don't skip this step. Don't just decide what you want to learn. Decide why. Write it down. Make it specific. Make it personal. Because that why is going to be the difference between stopping at the first plateau and pushing through to real skill. But even with a strong why, even with clear motivation, there's something else that determines whether you actually do the work. Your environment. Because here's something most people don't realize. Environment cues the brain into learning mode. Your brain is incredibly sensitive to context. It creates associations between places and mental states. If you always practice in a certain spot, your brain starts to automatically shift into learning mode when you enter that spot. This is why it's so hard to work in the same place where you relax. If your brain associates your desk with scrolling social media, it's going to want to scroll when you sit there to study. If you associate your couch with watching TV, it's going to be hard to read there. The environment is sending signals, and those signals are powerful. Fast learners create learning environments Not elaborate setups necessarily, just consistent context. A specific chair, a corner of a room, a particular coffee shop, somewhere that becomes associated with focus and practice. And when they enter that space, the transition is easier. Their brain knows what's about to happen. The resistance is lower. The focus comes faster. And within that environment, there's one factor that matters more than almost anything else. Fewer distractions increase learning per minute. This sounds obvious, but watch what people actually do. They sit down to learn with their phone next to them, with notifications on, with tabs open, with the TV in the background. And they wonder why learning feels slow, why it takes so long, why they can't seem to make progress. Every distraction isn't just a few seconds lost. It's a complete reset of your focus. Research shows it can take 15 to 20 minutes to get back to deep focus after an interruption. So if you're getting interrupted every 10 minutes, you never actually reach deep focus at all. You're skimming the surface the entire time. Your brain is in reactive mode, not learning mode. Fast learners are ruthless about removing distractions during practice. Phone in another room, internet blocker on, door closed. They protect their focus like it's precious, because it is. 20 minutes of completely focused practice accomplishes more than 2 hours of distracted half attention. The math is brutal. But once you see it, once you experience the difference, you can't unsee it. Now here's something interesting. Something that connects your body to your brain in ways you might not expect. Movement boosts attention and plasticity. Your brain wasn't designed to learn while sitting perfectly still. For most of human history, learning happened while moving, while exploring, while doing. And your brain still works better when your body is engaged. This doesn't mean you need to run while studying, but small movements help. Standing instead of sitting, walking while reviewing material, pacing while thinking through a problem. Even just fidgeting, even just subtle movement can increase alertness and improve focus. Your brain and body aren't separate systems. They're deeply interconnected. And when your body's active, even slightly, your brain becomes more receptive. And if you want to prime your brain for a learning session, if you want to arrive at practice in the optimal state, light exercise primes the brain for learning. A short walk, a few minutes of stretching, some jumping jacks, nothing exhausting, just enough to increase blood flow, to wake up your system, to shift out of whatever mental state you were in before. Exercise releases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like fertilizer for neurons. It increases plasticity. It makes your brain more ready to form new connections. Athletes know that the best time to practice technical skills is right after a moderate physical warm-up. The brain is alert, but not stressed, engaged, but not fatigued. That's the window. That's when learning happens fastest. And between practice sessions, when you need to rest, when you need to recover, there's a choice about how you rest. Active rest beats digital rest. Scrolling through your phone feels like rest. Watching videos feels like downtime. But it's not actually restful for your brain. You're still consuming information, still processing stimuli, still activating attention systems. Active rest is different. It's walking, it's stretching, it's sitting quietly, it's letting your mind wander without input. This kind of rest allows the diffuse mode of thinking we talked about earlier. It allows consolidation. It allows your brain to process what you just learned without new information competing for the same resources. Fast learners understand this. They take real breaks. They step away from screens. They let their brains actually rest. Now let's talk about the long game, about how learning compounds over time, about how you turn short-term effort into long-term mastery, because this is where it all comes together, where technique meets psychology meets time. Small daily improvements compound dramatically. You've probably heard about compound interest in finance, how a small percentage gain, repeated over years, becomes enormous. The same math applies to learning. If you improve by just 1% per day, by the end of a year, you're not 1% better. You're 37 times better. 37 times. That's the power of compounding. But here's the thing about compounding. It requires consistency. It requires showing up, not perfectly, not with maximum effort every single day, but regularly, reliably, because the magic isn't in any single day's work. The magic is in the accumulation, in the fact that each day builds on the previous day, that you're always starting from a slightly higher baseline. And here's what makes consistency possible. 15 focus minutes daily beats one long weekly session. Most people approach learning in bursts. They'll do nothing all week and then try to cram on the weekend. Or they'll be really intense for a few weeks and then burn out and do nothing for a month. This feels like effort. It feels like you're working hard, but it doesn't align with how the brain actually learns. The brain needs frequency, more than it needs duration. Short, frequent sessions are better than long, infrequent ones. 15 minutes every day gives you 7 exposures per week. That's 7 opportunities for encoding, 7 sleep cycles for consolidation. 7 times your brain gets the signal that this matters. Compare that to one 3-hour session per week. Same total time, completely different results. The daily session wins every time, because learning isn't just about the time you spend. It's about the number of times you revisit the material, the number of times you reactivate those neural pathways. Frequency creates durability, and 15 minutes is short enough that you can almost always find it. You can fit it in before work, during lunch, before bed. The barrier to entry is low, which means you're more likely to actually do it. But knowing you should do something and actually doing it are different things. This is where most learning plans fall apart. Not in the design, but in the execution. You know what you should do, you just don't do it. And this is where fast learners have one more advantage. Habit stacking removes the need for willpower. Habit stacking is simple. You take an existing habit, something you already do every day without thinking, and you stack your new learning behavior right after it. After I pour my morning coffee, I'll do 15 minutes of practice. After I brush my teeth at night, I'll review flashcards for 5 minutes. The existing habit becomes the trigger. It removes the decision. It removes the need to remember or motivate yourself. You're not relying on willpower. You're relying on momentum, on the fact that you're already doing the first thing, so doing the second thing is just the next step. This is how habits form, not through massive effort, but through consistent association, through linking new behaviors to existing routines until they become automatic. And you can make this even more powerful with one more technique. If, then plans automate consistency. This is about anticipating obstacles before they happen. If I'm too tired after work to practice, then I'll practice for just 5 minutes. If I miss a day, then I'll do a short session the next morning, no matter what. If I start feeling frustrated during practice, then I'll take 3 deep breaths and continue. These if-then statements are powerful because they make decisions in advance. When the obstacle actually appears, you don't have to think. You don't have to decide. You don't have to negotiate with yourself. You just follow the plan. Research shows that people who use if-then planning are significantly more likely to follow through on their intentions than people who just rely on general motivation. So here's what building a learning practice that lasts actually looks like. You start with a clear why that connects to something meaningful. You create an environment that cues focus and removes distractions. You use movement and light exercise to prime your brain. You take real, active rest between sessions. You commit to small, daily improvements rather than irregular bursts. You practice for 15 focused minutes rather than hoping to find hours. You stack your practice onto existing habits. And you create if-then plans for when obstacles appear. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being systematic. It's about setting up conditions where consistency becomes the path of least resistance, where learning happens almost automatically because you've designed your life to support it. And the beautiful thing is, once you set this up, once these systems are in place, learning stops being something you have to force yourself to do. It becomes part of your routine, part of your identity, part of how your days flow. You're not constantly making decisions about whether to practice. You're just practicing because that's what happens after coffee, because that's what you do in this particular chair, because that's who you are. This is how fast learners think about the long term, not as a test of willpower that they have to pass every single day, but as a system that carries them forward. A system that makes the right choice easy and the wrong choice require effort. They're not more disciplined than you. They're not stronger-willed. They've just set up their lives so that discipline isn't required as often. And over months and years, those small daily sessions compound. Those 15-minute practices accumulate. And one day, you look back and realize you're not a beginner anymore. You're competent, maybe even skilled. And it didn't happen through heroic effort or dramatic breakthroughs. It happened through showing up, through systems, through small improvements that compounded into something remarkable. That's the secret of long-term learning. That's how fast learners become masters, not through intensity alone, but through consistency, not through willpower, but through systems, not through trying harder, but through designing a life where learning is inevitable. And as you rest now, as sleep approaches, your brain is already preparing, already consolidating what you've heard, already getting ready to help you become someone who learns, not someday, starting tomorrow, with 15 minutes, with a clear why, with systems that make it easy. That's all it takes. And that's everything. The final layer, making fast learning inevitable. We've covered a lot: how the brain learns, what practice really means, how to build systems that last. But there's one more layer: the final pieces that separate people who make steady progress from people who make extraordinary progress. The subtle adjustments that turn a good learning practice into an exceptional one. And it starts before you even begin, because one of the biggest drains on your ability to learn isn't the learning itself. It's everything that happens before the learning. Reducing friction before starting preserves cognitive energy. Every decision you have to make, every obstacle you have to overcome, every bit of setup required before you can practice, all of that costs mental energy. And you only have so much of that energy each day. Fast learners understand this deeply. They don't wake up each morning and decide whether to practice. They don't spend 10 minutes looking for their materials. They don't have to figure out what to work on. All of that is decided in advance, automated, made frictionless. Their guitar is already out of its case. Their study materials are already on the desk. Their practice plan is already written. When it's time to learn, they just start. No decisions, no friction, no energy wasted on anything except the learning itself. This might seem like a small thing, but it's not. Think about how many times you've intended to practice something and then didn't, simply because there was too much setup involved, too many steps between the intention and the action. Fast learners eliminate those steps. They prepare their environment the night before. They reduce the activation energy required to begin. And that reduction in friction means they actually start. And starting is everything. But once you start, once you're in a practice session, there's another challenge: keeping the difficulty right. Not too easy, not too hard. And here's the technique for that. Difficulty layering keeps challenge optimal. You don't learn one thing until it's perfect, and then move to the next thing that's too slow, too rigid. Instead, you layer difficulties on top of each other gradually. Maybe you start practicing a skill at a slow speed. Once you can do it slowly, with reasonable accuracy, you don't wait until it's perfect. You increase the speed slightly. Now, you're back in the challenge zone. Then, maybe you add a variation. Then, another constraint. You're always working at multiple levels simultaneously, with each level at a different stage of development. This keeps you engaged. It prevents plateaus. It allows you to make progress on multiple dimensions at once. A musician might practice a piece slowly, with correct notes, faster with some errors, and at performance speed in small sections, all in the same session. They're not trying to perfect one level before moving to the next. They're cycling through difficulties, always working in that productive zone of challenge just beyond their current ability. And within each practice session, there's an optimal way to sequence your effort. Front-loading, hard work, exploits, peak focus. You have the most cognitive energy at the beginning of a session. Your focus is sharpest. Your patience is highest. This is when you should tackle the hardest, most demanding parts of what you're learning. Don't waste this peak state on easy warm-ups or review. Use it for the thing that requires the most from you. Later in the session, when you're starting to tire, that's when you review. That's when you practice things you already do well. That's when you do the easier variations. You're not trying to maximize every minute equally. You're trying to align task difficulty with your mental state. hard when you're fresh, easier when you're not. This simple sequencing can dramatically increase how much you actually accomplish in the same amount of time. Now, as skills become more complex, as you're juggling multiple elements, there's a way to reduce the mental burden. Turning skills into checklists reduces cognitive load. When you're learning something with multiple steps or components, trying to remember everything while also executing it is overwhelming. Your working memory can only hold so much, but a checklist externalizes that memory. Pilots use checklists not because they don't know how to fly, but because checklists ensure nothing is forgotten when there's pressure or fatigue. The same principle applies to any complex skill. A writer might have a checklist for revision. A programmer might have a checklist for debugging. A public speaker might have a checklist for preparation. These aren't crutches. They're tools that free up mental resources for the actual performance by removing the burden of remembering every step. And after each practice session, there's one more step that fast learners rarely skip. Reflection converts practice into a feedback loop. 5 minutes at the end of a session to ask yourself, what went well? What was difficult? What should I focus on next time? What did I learn today? This reflection isn't just looking back. It's programming your future practice. It's extracting lessons. It's turning raw experience into usable knowledge. Without reflection, practice is just repetition. You did the thing, and now you'll do it again tomorrow. Maybe slightly better, maybe not. But with reflection, practice becomes iteration. Each session informs the next. You're not just repeating, you're refining. You're building a mental model of your own learning process. And that meta-awareness, that understanding of how you personally learn this particular skill, is incredibly valuable. But even with all these internal systems, there's something external that can dramatically increase your consistency. Social accountability increases follow-through. When you tell someone what you're going to do, when someone is expecting to hear about your progress, when there's even mild social pressure, you're more likely to actually do it. This isn't about fear or judgment. It's about the simple fact that humans are social creatures, and we don't want to let others down. Fast learners often have accountability partners, study groups, coaches, online communities where they share progress. It doesn't have to be formal, just someone who knows what you're working on and occasionally asks how it's going. That small bit of external structure can be the difference between consistent practice and gradually fading effort. And here's a counterintuitive technique that can actually accelerate learning. Constraints force focus and accelerate skill development. When you have unlimited time, unlimited resources, unlimited options, learning can become diffuse, unfocused. You're trying to learn everything at once, but when you add constraints, when you say, I only have 20 minutes, or I can only use these 3 tools, or I have to complete this by Friday, suddenly you have to prioritize. You have to focus on what actually matters. Constraints aren't limitations. They're clarifiers. They force you to make decisions, to cut away the non-essential, to focus your effort where it counts. Some of the most rapid skill development happens under tight constraints. Not because the constraints make learning easier, but because They make it more focused, more intentional, more real. And as you practice, as you complete sessions and projects and milestones, there's an important mindset to maintain. Celebrate completion, not perfection. Perfectionism is one of the biggest killers of learning. It makes you never feel satisfied, never feel like you've accomplished anything, always focused on what's wrong rather than what's working. And that's exhausting. That's demotivating. That's a fast path to giving up. Fast learners celebrate finishing things, even if they're not perfect, even if they could be better. They acknowledge the work. They recognize the progress. They take a moment to appreciate that they showed up and did the thing. This isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing that completion is valuable, that finished is better than perfect, that the only way to get good is to complete many imperfect attempts. And if you can't celebrate those attempts, learning becomes joyless. And joyless learning doesn't last. This brings us to perhaps the most important principle of all, the one that underlies everything we've talked about, the one that determines whether you're still learning a year from now, 5 years from now, a decade from now. Consistency beats intensity over the long term. You can have an incredibly intense week of practice, 8 hours a day, total immersion, and you'll improve. But if you burn out and don't practice again for a month, that intensity meant nothing. Compare that to someone who practices 30 minutes a day, every day, for months. They're not trying to be heroic. They're not pushing to exhaustion. They're just showing up. And over time, the consistent person will surpass the intense person every single time. Because learning compounds. But it only compounds if you keep showing up, if you stay in the game long enough for the compounding to work. This is why all the systems we've talked about, the habit stacking, the if-then plans, the friction reduction, the environmental cues, all of it is in service of consistency, because consistency is the engine. Everything else is just making sure the engine keeps running, making sure you don't flame out, making sure you're still practicing next month, next year, 10 years from now. And here's the final truth, the one that should give you hope, the one that should change how you see yourself and what you're capable of. Learning speed isn't talent, it's leverage. When you see someone learning quickly, when you see someone mastering skills that seem difficult, it's tempting to think they're just naturally gifted, that they have some ability you don't have. But that's almost never what's happening. What's happening is leverage. They've figured out the principles we've talked about. They're using active recall instead of passive review. They're spacing their practice. They're getting fast feedback. They're working in the optimal challenge zone. They're using mental rehearsal and interleaving and variation. They're building systems that make consistency easy. They're not more talented. They're more leveraged. And leverage is available to anyone. It's not about genetics or natural ability. It's about understanding how learning works and aligning your approach with those principles. It's about technique, not talent. About systems, not willpower. About leverage, not innate gifts. Every single principle we've discussed in this entire journey, all of it is learnable. All of it is available to you. Think about what that means. It means that learning speed isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you develop, something you build, something you get better at over time. You can learn how to learn, And once you understand these principles and build these systems, everything changes. Every new skill becomes more accessible. Every challenge becomes more approachable. You stop seeing learning as this mysterious process that either happens or doesn't. You see it as a set of techniques you can deploy. So, as we come to the end of this journey, as you prepare to rest and sleep, know this: you now understand how fast learners think. You know the principles they use. You know the systems they build. You know the mistakes they avoid and the techniques they leverage. None of this is secret knowledge. None of this is available only to a gifted few. It's all here. It's all yours. The only question is whether you'll use it. And using it doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require implementing everything at once. It just requires starting, picking one principle, building one system, making one small change to how you approach learning. And then another, and another, not all at once, not heroically, just consistently, just one small improvement at a time. Because that's how it works. That's how you become someone who learns quickly, not through dramatic transformation, but through accumulated advantage, through small edges that compound, through understanding that learning isn't magic, it's mechanics. And mechanics can be learned, can be practiced, can be mastered. You have everything you need. The knowledge is here. The principles are clear. The techniques are proven. What happens next is up to you. Will you stay the same, approaching learning the way you always have? Or will you experiment? Will you try these principles? Will you build these systems? Will you become someone who learns not just adequately, but remarkably? The choice is yours. But know this: the capability is already there. The potential is already present. You don't need to become someone different. You just need to learn differently, to practice differently, to think differently about what learning is and how it happens. And starting tomorrow, with just 15 minutes, with just one principle, with just one small system, you can begin. You can start becoming the kind of learner you've always wanted to be, not through talent, through leverage, not through intensity, through consistency, not through perfection, through completion. That's the path. That's the way forward. And now, finally, you know exactly how to walk it. Rest now, sleep deeply. Your brain is already consolidating everything you've heard, already preparing to help you learn in new ways, already becoming the tool you need it to be. And when you wake, when you're ready, the journey of faster learning begins. Not someday, not when you're ready, now, because you already are ready. You always have been. You just needed to understand how, and now you do.